A millionaire CEO took his nanny to a company gala. When his manipulative ex-fiancée showed up trying to humiliate her, what the nanny did next left 300 guests absolutely speechless and revealed a secret that changed everything. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments below. It's incredible to see our Deep Stories family growing across the globe. If you believe in second chances, that love can be found in unexpected places, and that true worth has nothing to do with job titles, hit that subscribe button right now. This is James and Sarah's story, a tale of loss, healing, and discovering that sometimes the person meant to save you has been there all along. Let's begin. James' heart stood in his daughter's doorway at 2 in the morning, watching her sleep. Sophie was 6 years old with her mother's dark curls and his green eyes, and she was having another nightmare. This was the third one this week. James could tell by the way her small hands clutched her stuffed rabbit, by the slight furrow in her brow even in sleep. He was a CEO. He ran a tech company worth billions. He made decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of customers. But he couldn't fix his daughter's nightmares. He couldn't bring back her mother. And he was failing at the most important job he'd ever had, being Sophie's father. Daddy? Sophie's voice was small in the darkness. Her eyes opened, finding him immediately. I had the dream again. The one where Mommy's car— I know, sweetheart. James crossed the room in 3 strides, sitting on the edge of her bed. It's okay. I'm here. I miss her, Sophie whispered, and James felt his heart crack the way it did every time his daughter said those 3 words. It had been 3 years since the accident. 3 years since his wife Emma had been driving home from her sister's house in the rain, since the truck had run the red light, since James's entire world had shattered into before and after. I miss her too, James said quietly, brushing Sophie's curls back from her forehead. Every single day. Mrs. Peterson says I need to eat my vegetables, Sophie said, changing the subject the way children do when emotions become too big. Mrs. Peterson was their current housekeeper, a stern woman in her 60s who followed every rule James set but had all the warmth of a filing cabinet. But she makes them gross. Not like how Mommy used to make them. James closed his eyes. They'd had 4 housekeepers in 3 years, all perfectly competent. All completely incapable of filling the void Emma had left. I'll talk to her about the vegetables. She also won't read me the princess books because she says they're inappropriate gender stereotyping. Sophie made air quotes with her tiny fingers, and James would have laughed if his heart weren't breaking. I'll read them to you tomorrow, he promised, knowing even as he said it that he'd probably be stuck in a meeting until 8. Now try to sleep, okay? But as he tucked Sophie back in and returned to his own empty bedroom, James knew something had to change. He was drowning. Between running the company and trying to be both mother and father to Sophie, he was failing at everything. He needed help, real help. Not another Mrs. Peterson who followed rules but didn't understand that his daughter needed warmth. Needed someone who could chase away nightmares and make vegetables taste good and read princess stories without a lecture on gender politics. The next morning, James called his assistant. Jessica, I need you to find me a new nanny. Someone different this time. Someone who actually understands children. Not just someone with the right credentials. I need someone with heart. I'll start searching immediately, Mr. Hart, Jessica replied, and James heard the understanding in her voice. Jessica had been with him for 10 years. She'd watched him transform from a driven but happy man into someone who simply existed, moving from task to task without joy. The interviews began 2 days later. James met them all in his home office while Sophie was at school. First came Rebecca, who had a master's degree in early childhood education and the personality of a textbook. Then Marcus, who seemed great until he admitted he'd never actually worked with a child who'd experienced loss. Then Patricia, who spent the entire interview on her phone. Then David, who kept calling Sophie the child, as if she were a project rather than a person. By the 5th interview, James was ready to give up. And then Sarah Mitchell walked into his office and something shifted. She wasn't what he expected. Most of the candidates had come in expensive business casual, carrying leather portfolios and lists of credentials. Sarah wore simple jeans and a soft blue sweater that looked like it had been washed 100 times. Her light brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She carried a worn canvas bag instead of a briefcase. She looked real, approachable, like someone who might actually know how to comfort a 6-year-old with nightmares. "Mr. Hart," she said, her handshake firm but warm. "Thank you for seeing me. Your resume is—" James paused, looking down at the single page Jessica had given him. It was sparse compared to the others. No master's degrees. No list of wealthy families she'd worked for. Just 5 years as a private tutor and nanny, excellent references, and a note that she was available immediately. "Different from the others I've seen." "I don't have fancy credentials," Sarah said simply. "But I love children. I understand them, and I'm very good at what I do." There was something in her voice, a quiet confidence that made James look up from the resume to really see her. She had warm, brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she gave a small smile. She looked kind. More than that, she looked like someone who had known loss and learned how to keep living anyway. "Tell me why you want this position," James said, leaning back in his chair. Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I want to make a difference in a child's life. Your assistant mentioned that Sophie lost her mother 3 years ago. I can't imagine how difficult that's been for her or for you. I'd like to help if you'll let me. Not just with the basic care and routines, but with the healing, with helping her feel safe and loved and normal again." "And you think you can do that?" James asked, and he hated how desperate he sounded. Everyone else promised they could help. "None of them did." "I think Sophie will tell you whether I can or not," Sarah said. "Children know who genuinely cares about them. Why don't you let me meet her? If we don't connect, you've lost nothing. But if we do?" She trailed off, and James found himself nodding. "Sophie gets home from school at 3:30, he said. "Can you stay?" Of course. James had 3 video calls scheduled for that afternoon, but he canceled all of them. He wanted to observe this meeting. Something about Sarah Mitchell made him cautious and hopeful in equal measure, and he needed to see how Sophie reacted to her before making any decisions. When the school bus dropped Sophie off, James met her at the door as always. "Hey, sweetheart. How was school?" "Fine," Sophie said, which was her standard answer. "We learned about fractions, but I don't understand why we need to cut pies into pieces." "Why can't we just eat the whole pie?" James smiled despite himself. "I have someone I'd like you to meet. Her name is Sarah, and she might come spend some time with us. Is that okay?" Sophie's face closed off immediately. "Like Mrs. Peterson?" "No," James said firmly. "Not like Mrs. Peterson. Come meet her and tell me what you think." He led Sophie into the living room where Sarah was waiting and watched carefully as his daughter's eyes found the stranger. Sarah didn't do what the others had done, didn't immediately approach with a too bright smile and a condescending tone. Instead, she simply smiled gently and stayed seated. "Hi, Sophie," Sarah said. "Your dad told me you have a stuffed rabbit. I have a stuffed elephant named Peanut. I've had him since I was your age." Sophie's eyes widened slightly. "Really? You still have him?" "Of course. Some friends are forever, right?" Sophie moved closer, curious now. "What's your rabbit's name?" "His name is Carrots," Sophie said, and then almost shyly, "Do you really still sleep with your elephant?" "Every night," Sarah said seriously. "He's very good at keeping nightmares away." Sophie's eyes found her father's face, then returned to Sarah. "I have nightmares. About my mom. She died in a car accident, and sometimes I dream about it even though I wasn't there." James's breath caught. Sophie rarely talked about the nightmares so directly, especially not with strangers. But Sarah didn't flinch, didn't offer empty platitudes or false cheer. "That must be really scary," Sarah said quietly. "I lost someone important too, and I had nightmares for a long time. Do you know what helped me?" Sophie shook her head. "I started drawing pictures of good memories instead. Every time I had a nightmare, the next morning I would draw something happy that I remembered about the person I lost. It didn't make the nightmares go away completely, but it helped me remember that the good memories were stronger than the scary ones." "I like drawing," Sophie said, and she moved to sit on the couch next to Sarah. close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Could you teach me?" "I would love to," Sarah said. And when she looked up at James, he saw understanding in her eyes. Not pity, not the awkward sympathy he'd gotten used to from others. Just genuine understanding from someone who had walked through fire and survived. "Sarah," James said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Would you like to start on Monday?" Sarah's smile was like sunrise. "I would love that." That night, after Sarah had left and Sophie was in bed, James sat alone in his home office and wondered what he'd just done. He'd hired a nanny with minimal credentials based almost entirely on instinct and the fact that his daughter had smiled for the first time in weeks. It was impulsive, unprofessional, completely unlike him. And yet, for the first time in 3 years, James' heart felt something that might have been hope. Sarah Mitchell started work on Monday morning, and within 3 days, James's house felt different. He couldn't quite put his finger on what had changed. The furniture was all in the same places. Mrs. Peterson still came to clean twice a week. The routines were essentially unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted, like someone had opened windows in a house that had been sealed shut for too long. Sophie stopped having nightmares. Or rather, when she did have them, she would pad down the hall to the guest room where Sarah now stayed, and Sarah would comfort her back to sleep. James discovered this accidentally one night when he woke to check on Sophie and found her bed empty, his heart stopping, until he heard soft voices from Sarah's room. He'd stood in the hallway, listening to Sarah tell Sophie a story about a brave princess who learned that being scared didn't mean being weak, that the strongest people were the ones who felt afraid but kept going anyway. The vegetables became edible. Sarah had somehow coaxed Sophie into helping prepare dinner. And suddenly his daughter, who'd refused anything green, was happily eating roasted Brussels sprouts because we made them together. Daddy, and Sarah says they're baby cabbages, which is funny. The house filled with laughter again. James would come home from the office to find Sarah and Sophie doing art projects at the kitchen table, or building elaborate pillow forts, or reading together on the couch. Once he arrived to discover them both covered in flour, the kitchen a disaster, attempting to recreate Emma's chocolate chip cookie recipe that James had thought was lost forever. "We found it," Sophie had announced proudly, brandishing a recipe card. It was in the cookbook on the top shelf. Sarah helped me reach it. James had taken that recipe card with shaking hands. Seeing his wife's handwriting, her little notes in the margins about adding extra vanilla, about how Sophie loved these cookies warm, and something in his chest had cracked open. He'd expected it to hurt. Instead, it felt like healing. "Thank you," he'd said to Sarah later, after Sophie was asleep and they were cleaning the flour-covered kitchen together. "For everything. But especially for this." She needed those cookies, Sarah had said simply, efficiently wiping down counters. She needed that connection to her mother. And you needed it too, even if you didn't know it. James had looked at his nanny, really looked at her and wondered who she really was. Because Sarah Mitchell didn't talk like someone who'd simply been a tutor and nanny for 5 years. She spoke with an educated precision, used vocabulary that seemed almost academic. And sometimes he caught her reading when she thought no one was watching. Not romance novels or magazines, heavy books, philosophy, psychology, literature, and what he was pretty sure was French. "Sarah," he'd asked impulsively, "what did you do before you were a nanny?" She'd gone very still, her hand pausing mid-wipe. "I was a teacher." "What kind of teacher?" "The kind that doesn't teach anymore," she'd said quietly, and something in her tone told James not to push further. Whatever Sarah was running from or hiding from, she wasn't ready to share it, and that was okay. He of all people understood that some wounds took time to heal. 6 weeks after Sarah started, James was preparing for his company's annual charity gala. It was the biggest event Hart Technologies hosted each year. 300 guests, major donors, potential investors, and every journalist and society columnist in the city. James usually attended alone, made appropriate small talk, gave his speech, and left as early as socially acceptable. He hated these events. They felt hollow, performative, but they were necessary for the company. "I don't want you to go," Sophie announced the night before the gala, her lower lip trembling. You're always gone. And tomorrow's Saturday. You promised we'd go to the zoo. James's heart sank. He had promised. And then he'd forgotten. Again. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry. This event is important for the company. I have to. You always have to. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. You're always busy. The company is more important than me. Sophie, that's not... But she was already running upstairs, and James heard her bedroom door slam. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. Father of the Year, clearly. She doesn't really think that. Sarah's voice came from the kitchen doorway. She's 6. She's testing boundaries and expressing feelings she doesn't have words for yet. But James... She moved into the room, and he noticed she'd used his first name for the first time. She's not entirely wrong either. When was the last time you spent a full day with her? Not just an hour before bed or a quick breakfast. A full day? I don't have full days, James said, and he heard how defensive he sounded. I'm running a company. I'm a single parent. I'm doing the best I can. I know you are, Sarah said, and she sat down across from him. But Sophie's 6. She won't be 6 forever. She won't always want to go to the zoo with her dad. And you're drowning yourself in work because it's easier than feeling everything you lost. I understand that. I really do. But you're going to miss her childhood if you're not careful. James looked up sharply. You don't know anything about my life. You're right, Sarah said calmly. I don't. I only know what I see. And what I see is a good man, a good father, who's forgotten how to live because he's been too busy surviving. The gala is important. But is it more important than your daughter? Of course not. Then prove it, Sarah said. Take her to the gala with you. James stared. That's a black-tie charity event with hundreds of adults. It's not appropriate for a 6-year-old. Make it appropriate, Sarah challenged. Or better yet, take me too. I'll watch Sophie during the business parts. And she gets to see her father in his element. Gets to be part of his world instead of always being left behind in it. I can't ask you to give up your Saturday night for a work event. You're not asking. I'm offering. Sarah's brown eyes were serious. Take us both. Let Sophie get dressed up and feel special. Let her see that her father's work is important, but that she's important too, important enough to be included. And that was how James Hart found himself arriving at the Metropolitan Museum's Grand Hall on Saturday evening with his 6-year-old daughter in a princess dress and his nanny in a simple but elegant navy gown that made him do a double take when she'd emerged from her room. Sophie was vibrating with excitement. Daddy, this is like a castle! Look at all the pretty lights! And everyone's dressed up like they're going to meet the queen. James couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. Several colleagues did double takes as he entered with Sophie and Sarah, but he ignored their surprise. Let them wonder. This was more important. Remember what we talked about, Sarah said quietly to Sophie. Inside voices, stay close to your dad or me, and if you get tired, we can leave early. I won't get tired, Sophie insisted. This is the best night ever! James made his rounds, introducing Sophie to colleagues and donors. He was surprised by how many people softened when they met his daughter, how what were usually stiff business conversations became genuine exchanges when Sophie was part of them. She was charming without trying to be, asking questions with 6-year-old directness that made people laugh. Is that a real diamond? She'd asked Mrs. Chen, one of their biggest investors, pointing at her necklace. It is, Mrs. Chen had replied, amused. Wow, Daddy, when I grow up, can I have diamonds? You can have anything you want, sweetheart, James had said. Meaning it. I want a puppy more than diamonds, Sophie had declared. And Mrs. Chen had laughed so hard she'd had tears in her eyes. Everything was going perfectly. And then Victoria walked in. James saw her across the room and his entire body went rigid. Victoria Ashford, his ex-fiancée, the woman he'd almost married before he'd met Emma. The woman who had disappeared from his life after Emma died, unable to handle his grief, only to reappear periodically whenever she needed something or wanted to remind him of what they'd had. She was stunning, as always. A red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Diamonds at her throat and ears. Hair styled perfectly. She saw James immediately, and her eyes lit up with predatory interest. James, Victoria purred, crossing the room with practiced grace. I heard you might be here. You look wonderful. And who is this? Her eyes swept over Sophie and Sarah with barely concealed disdain. Victoria, James said stiffly. This is my daughter Sophie. And this is Sarah Mitchell. Your Nanny? Victoria's smile sharpened. How quaint, bringing the help to a charity gala. That's a new one, even for you. James felt Sarah go very still beside him. Sophie, sensing tension she didn't understand, pressed closer to Sarah's side. Sarah is part of our family, James said firmly. She's more than welcome here. Of course, of course. Victoria waved a dismissive hand. I didn't mean any offense. I'm sure she's very good at whatever it is she does. The way Victoria said it made it clear she thought Sarah did very little of value. Sarah takes care of Sophie, James said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, which makes her invaluable, I'm sure. Victoria turned her attention fully to James, essentially dismissing Sarah and Sophie as irrelevant. We should talk. I've been meaning to reach out. I know it's been difficult for you, being alone all this time. I thought perhaps we could have dinner sometime. Discuss old times, maybe new beginnings? The implication was crystal clear. Victoria wanted back in his life, and she expected him to be grateful for the attention. James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Sophie tugged on Sarah's hand and whispered something. Sarah's expression shifted, became focused and alert in a way James had never seen before. Excuse me, Sarah said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made even Victoria pause. But I think it's time for Sophie to meet some of the other guests. James, we'll be near the refreshment table if you need us. She guided Sophie away smoothly, but not before James saw the grateful look Sophie gave her. His daughter had been uncomfortable, and Sarah had extracted her from the situation with grace and care. So, Victoria said, reclaiming his attention, about that dinner. But James was watching Sarah and Sophie across the room, watching as Sarah knelt down to Sophie's level and said something that made his daughter giggle. And he realized that he'd rather be over there with them than standing here with a woman who'd never understood what actually mattered. I'm sorry, Victoria, James said. Not sorry at all. But I'm exactly where I want to be already. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back to my daughter. He walked away from Victoria's stunned face and didn't look back. Some doors once closed should stay closed, and some new doors, like the one Sarah and Sophie had opened in his life, deserved to be walked through with both hands open. The real surprise of the evening, however, was yet to come. 20 minutes later, James was making small talk with the mayor when he heard a commotion near the main stage. He turned to see Victoria at the microphone, her smile razor-sharp, and his stomach dropped. This couldn't be good. Good evening, everyone, Victoria's voice rang out across the grand hall, silencing conversations. I hope you're all enjoying this wonderful event. I wanted to take a moment to recognize someone very special here tonight. Her eyes found Sarah and Sophie at the refreshment table. James Hart's nanny, Sarah Mitchell. It's so wonderful that James brought his household staff tonight. It really shows his commitment, too. She paused dramatically. Inclusivity. Even if some people might feel a bit out of place at an event like this. The room went awkwardly quiet. Several guests looked uncomfortable. James started moving toward the stage, fury building in his chest, but someone else moved faster. Sarah handed Sophie to Mrs. Chen, whom they'd been chatting with, and walked calmly toward the stage. She moved with a quiet dignity that made people step aside automatically. When she reached the microphone, Victoria looked surprised but didn't relinquish it. May I? Sarah asked politely, and something in her tone made Victoria step back. Sarah took the microphone, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the hall with a calm authority that made even James stop and stare. Thank you for those kind words, Ms. Ashford. You're right that I'm James Hart's nanny. I take care of his daughter Sophie, which is one of the greatest privileges of my life. And you're also right that I might seem out of place at an event like this. She paused, and James saw something shift in her expression, a decision being made. You see, 3 years ago, I was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, professor of child psychology at Columbia University. I had published 2 books on childhood trauma and grief. I gave keynote speeches at conferences very much like this one. I was on track for tenure and considered a rising star in my field. The room was completely silent now. Even Victoria had gone pale. And then my younger sister and her husband died in a car accident, Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the emotion James could hear underneath. They left behind 2 beautiful children who were suddenly orphaned. I became their guardian overnight, and I realized that all my research, all my academic knowledge, meant nothing compared to actually being there for 2 grieving children who needed stability more than they needed an aunt with impressive credentials. James felt like someone had punched him in the chest. Sarah. Dr. Sarah Mitchell. He'd heard that name before years ago. Emma had owned one of her books, a groundbreaking text on helping children process loss. Oh, God. I took a leave of absence that turned permanent, Sarah said. I raised my niece and nephew, and when they were finally stable enough, when they'd healed enough to not need me every minute of every day, I discovered something. I didn't want to go back to academia. I didn't want to research childhood development. I wanted to be part of it. I wanted to help children heal, but directly, personally, one child at a time. She turned to look directly at Victoria. So yes, I'm a nanny. I'm proud to be a nanny. And I'm especially proud to be Sophie's nanny because that little girl is extraordinary. She's brave and kind, and she's learning to carry her grief with grace, and her father— Sarah's eyes found James in the crowd. Is one of the best men I've ever met, because despite building an empire and carrying his own grief, he still makes room to love his daughter with everything he has. The room erupted in applause. Not polite charity gala applause, but real, genuine clapping that went on and on. Victoria had disappeared into the crowd, and Mrs. Chen was clapping enthusiastically with Sophie balanced on her hip. But James couldn't move. He could only stare at Sarah as she handed the microphone back to the event coordinator and started walking toward him. "You're Dr. Mitchell," he said when she reached him. "The Dr. Mitchell, I have your book at home. Emma used it after her mother died. She said it changed her understanding of grief." "I'm Sarah," she corrected gently. "Just Sarah. The other person. She doesn't exist anymore." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to hire me because of my credentials," Sarah said simply. "I wanted you to hire me because Sophie and I connected. Because you trusted me with her, not because you trusted my degrees." James looked at this remarkable woman who had walked into his life 6 weeks ago and changed everything. "I need some air," he said roughly. "Will you come with me? Mrs. Chen can watch Sophie for a moment." Sarah nodded, and they walked out onto the museum's balcony overlooking Central Park. The night air was cool, the city lights spread out before them like scattered stars. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you," Sarah said quietly. "About my background." "Don't apologize," James said. "I understand why you didn't. But Sarah, you gave up everything. Your career, your research, your future, for your niece and nephew." "I didn't give up anything that mattered," Sarah said firmly. "I traded a career for family. That's not a sacrifice. That's a choice. And I'd make it again in a heartbeat." She turned to face him. "You understand that, don't you? You've been making the same choice for 3 years. Balancing your career with being the father Sophie needs. I haven't been very successful at the balancing part," James admitted. "You're doing better than you think," Sarah said. "You brought her tonight. You let her be part of your world. That matters more than you know." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and James became acutely aware of how close they were standing. How the moonlight caught in Sarah's hair. How her simple navy dress somehow made her more beautiful than any of the designer gowns inside. How she smelled like vanilla and something else he couldn't identify. How much he wanted to. "James." Sarah's voice was soft. "We should go back inside. Sophie will be wondering where we are." She was right. Of course she was right. Sarah was his employee, Sophie's nanny, the woman who had saved both of them from drowning in grief, getting involved. Romantically would complicate everything, would risk the stability Sophie needed, would be completely inappropriate given their employer-employee relationship. James knew all of this logically, but his heart, which had been frozen for 3 years, was starting to thaw. And it was thawing for a woman who made cookies with his daughter, who read princess stories without judgment, who had given up everything once for family and would probably do it again. A woman who understood loss and healing and second chances. "Sarah," he said before he could stop himself, "would you have dinner with me? Not as my employee, not as Sophie's nanny, just as you and me?" Sarah's eyes widened. "James, I know it's complicated," he said quickly. "I know the timing is terrible and the situation is messy and there are 1,000 reasons why this is a bad idea. But I haven't felt this alive in 3 years. And I hope, you might feel something too." Sarah was quiet for so long that James was sure he'd miscalculated, sure he'd ruined everything. But then she said very quietly, "I feel it too. But James, I work for you. I take care of Sophie. If this goes wrong, then we'll figure it out," James said. "Together. Like we've figured everything else out." He took a deep breath. "I'm not asking you to risk anything tonight. I'm just asking if you'd be willing to explore this, whatever this is, between us, slowly, carefully, with Sophie's well-being as our top priority." "You make it sound so reasonable," Sarah said with a small laugh. "But falling for your employer is never reasonable." "Falling?" James seized on the word, hope blooming in his chest. Sarah covered her face with her hands. "I have terrible professional boundaries, apparently. Yes, James. I'm falling for you. I've been falling for you since you interviewed me and looked so lost and desperate and determined to be a good father that I wanted to fix everything for you. And I know that's a terrible idea, and I should probably quit and—" James kissed her. It was soft and gentle and tasted like new beginnings. When they pulled apart, they were both breathless. "Don't quit," James said. "Please don't quit. We'll figure this out. Together?" "Together," Sarah agreed, and then she smiled. "But we're telling Sophie very, very carefully. And very, very slowly." "Agreed," James said, and kissed her again because he could, because she was letting him, because for the first time in 3 years he felt like he could breathe again. Inside, Sophie was regaling Mrs. Chen with a story about her stuffed rabbit carrots, completely oblivious to the fact that her father's entire world had just shifted on its axis. Victoria had left early, her attempt to embarrass Sarah having backfired spectacularly. The gala continued around them, but James and Sarah stood on that balcony a little while longer, holding hands and watching the city lights, both of them silently grateful for second chances and unexpected love. "We should go back," Sarah said finally, "before people start talking." "Let them talk," James said, but he let her lead him inside anyway because she was right. They needed to be smart about this, for Sophie's sake. But as they rejoined the party, as James watched Sarah laugh with Sophie and help his daughter chase down a runaway napkin, he knew with absolute certainty that he was going to marry this woman. Maybe not today, maybe not even this year, but eventually. Because Sarah Mitchell, Dr. Mitchell, professor, author, aunt, nanny, and now the woman he loved, was his second chance. And he wasn't going to waste it. James and Sarah agreed to take things slowly. They would date privately, carefully, always with Sophie's emotional well-being as the top priority. They wouldn't tell Sophie anything until they were absolutely certain this was permanent. They would be professional when others were around. They would be cautious and reasonable and mature about the entire situation. They lasted exactly 4 days before Sophie figured it out anyway. "You like each other," Sophie announced at breakfast on Thursday morning, pointing her spoon at them accusingly. Like, the way Emma liked Jake in my class before he moved away." James nearly choked on his coffee. Sarah went very still, her hand frozen halfway to her orange juice. "What makes you think that, sweetheart?" James asked carefully. "You smile at each other weird," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "And yesterday when Sarah was reading to me, you came in and you both got all—" She scrunched up her face, searching for the word. "Blushy. And you hold hands when you think I'm not looking." James looked at Sarah helplessly. They'd been so careful, or at least they'd thought they were. Apparently 6-year-olds were more observant than they'd given credit for. "Sophie," Sarah said gently, "how would you feel if your dad and I did like each other? Would that bother you?" Sophie considered this seriously, swinging her legs under the table. "Would you stop being my nanny?" "Never," Sarah said immediately. "Even if things changed between your dad and me, I would still be here for you. I would still read you stories and make cookies and help chase away nightmares. That wouldn't change." "Would you be my new mom?" The question hung in the air, heavy with hope and fear and the memory of a woman who couldn't be replaced. James opened his mouth to answer, but Sarah beat him to it. "No one could ever replace your mom," Sarah said firmly. "Your mom loved you so much, Sophie, and that love is yours forever. Nothing I feel for you, nothing that might happen between your dad and me would ever take that away." She paused, then continued carefully. "But if your dad and I did become more than friends, I hope we could figure out what that means together. All three of us, as a family. Not me replacing your mom, but me becoming someone new in your life. Someone who loves you very much and wants to be here for you." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, and James held his breath. Then his daughter nodded slowly. "Okay, but you have to promise you won't leave. Mrs. Peterson left, and so did Miss Amanda before her and Miss Rebecca before her. Everyone always leaves." James felt his heart crack. He hadn't realized Sophie had been keeping score of all the people who had come and gone from her life. First her mother, then a string of housekeepers and nannies who had seemed permanent until they weren't. "I promise," Sarah said, and there were tears in her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. Wild horses couldn't drag me away from you." "What about regular horses?" Sophie asked. Because 6-year-olds were literal like that. "Not even regular horses," Sarah confirmed, laughing through her tears. "I'm here to stay," Sophie nodded, satisfied. "Okay, then you can like Daddy, but you have to do it right. You have to go on dates and get married and maybe have a baby so I can have a sister. Brothers are probably okay too, but I'd prefer a sister." James and Sarah looked at each other, both trying not to laugh at how quickly Sophie had planned their entire future. "We'll take it one step at a time, sweetheart," James said. "But I'm glad you're okay with Sarah and I being friends." "More than friends," Sophie corrected. "Boyfriend and girlfriend. Like in the movies, except you're both old, so it's different." "Gee, thanks," James said dryly, but he was smiling. After that, things became both easier and more complicated. Easier because they didn't have to hide their growing feelings from Sophie, who appointed herself their official relationship cheerleader and regularly told them they needed to hold hands more and maybe kiss because that's what people do when they like each other. More complicated, because James's business associates and society friends had very strong opinions about a CEO dating his daughters. "Nanny, it's a scandal," his mother said when she found out. "James, what are you thinking?" "She works for you. The power dynamic is completely inappropriate. And what will people say?" "I'm thinking that I'm in love with her," James said calmly. "And I don't care what people say. Sarah makes me happy. She makes Sophie happy. That's all that matters." "But her background is exceptional," James interrupted. "She was Dr. Sarah Mitchell Mother, Columbia professor, published author, recognized expert in childhood psychology. She gave up her career to raise her orphaned niece and nephew, and then chose to continue working with children directly because that's where her passion is. She's remarkable." His mother was quiet for a moment. "Dr. Mitchell? The Dr. Mitchell who wrote Healing Young Hearts? I have that book. It's extraordinary. That's her. And she's even more extraordinary in person," his mother sighed. "Then I suppose I'd like to meet her properly. For Sunday dinner. If she's going to be part of Sophie's life, part of your life, we should do this correctly." The dinner with James's family was nerve-wracking for Sarah, but she needn't have worried. Sophie monopolized the conversation, regaling her grandmother with stories about Sarah's teaching methods and how they'd memorized all the state capitals using a song Sarah had made up. James's mother, previously skeptical, watched Sarah interact with Sophie and slowly began to smile. "You're good for them," James's mother said quietly to Sarah after dinner. When James and Sophie were in the other room arguing cheerfully about which movie to watch, "I haven't seen my son smile like this since Emma. And Sophie is like a different child, lighter, happier." "They're good for me too," Sarah said honestly. "They've given me purpose again, family again, a chance to use everything I learned, but in a way that feels real and meaningful." "Do you love him?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes, with everything I have." "Good," James's mother said, and pulled Sarah into an unexpected hug. "Then welcome to the family, dear. We're a bit intense, but we love fiercely." 6 months after that gala, where Victoria had tried to humiliate her, Sarah moved out of the guest room and into James's bedroom. They'd talked to Sophie about it extensively first, making sure she understood what was happening and was comfortable with the changes. Sophie had rolled her eyes and said, "Finally! You two are so slow!" which had made both adults laugh. James sold his company Penthouse, too many memories of his marriage to Emma, too much of a shrine to the past, and they found a new home together. A beautiful brownstone with a yard where Sophie could play and room for the little sister or brother she kept insisting she needed. Sarah's niece and nephew, now teenagers, came to visit often, calling James Uncle James, with the ease of children who'd expanded their definition of family to include whoever loved and cared for them. But the real moment of truth came one ordinary Tuesday evening. James was working late, and Sarah was helping Sophie with a school project about family trees. Sophie had drawn James and Emma at the top, with a line down to herself. And then she'd drawn another branch. Sarah connected to both Sophie and James with careful lines. "Is this okay?" Sophie asked quietly. "I know Sarah's not my real mom, but she feels like family. Can I put her on my family tree?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Sophie, that's one of the most beautiful things anyone has ever done for me." "Of course it's okay. But what if kids at school say it's wrong? That she's just the nanny? Then you tell them that family isn't about job titles," Sarah said firmly. "Family is about love, and I love you more than anything in the world." "More than chocolate?" Sophie asked, because she needed to test these declarations. "More than chocolate. More than puppies?" "More than puppies. More than daddy?" Sarah smiled. "Different than daddy, but yes, just as much. You and your dad are the two most important people in my whole life, and I'm so grateful I get to be part of your family tree." Sophie nodded, satisfied, and continued drawing. She added leaves to the branches and flowers around the edges, and at the bottom she wrote in careful 6-year-old handwriting, "My family, the real kind." When James came home an hour later, Sarah showed him the drawing. He stood in the kitchen doorway, still in his suit, and stared at that family tree with his daughter's careful lines, connecting all of them together. Then he pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "I was going to wait," he said. "Plan something elaborate. Make it perfect. But I think Sophie just gave me the perfect moment." He dropped to one knee right there in the kitchen while Sarah stared at him in shock. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who gave up everything once for family and then somehow gave me and Sophie everything we needed. Will you marry me? Will you officially become part of this family tree?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. "Yes, of course, yes." They kissed in the kitchen while Sophie's family tree drawing watched from the refrigerator door where it was already proudly displayed with a magnet. And when Sophie woke up the next morning to find Sarah wearing a ring, she screamed so loud that the neighbors probably heard her 3 blocks away. "I knew it! I told you they'd get married, carrots," she said to her stuffed rabbit. "I'm going to be the flower girl and wear a princess dress and everything." "Actually," Sarah said, kneeling down to Sophie's level, "I was hoping you'd be something even more special. Not just the flower girl, but my maid of honor. Because you're not just a child at our wedding, Sophie. You're the reason this family exists. You're the heart of everything." Sophie threw her arms around Sarah's neck. "Best day ever." And 3 months later, on a perfect September afternoon, James Hart married Sarah Mitchell in a small ceremony in the Brownstones' garden. Sophie stood proudly beside Sarah as her maid of honor, holding a bouquet of flowers and beaming so widely her face might have split in half. Sarah's niece and nephew were there, now 17 and 15, happy to see their aunt so loved. James's mother dabbed at her eyes throughout the entire ceremony, but the most beautiful moment came at the end, when the minister pronounced them husband and wife. Instead of just kissing Sarah, James knelt down and kissed Sophie's forehead, too. "I'm not just marrying Sarah today," he said clearly, so everyone could hear. "I'm promising both of you that our family, this beautiful, unexpected, perfectly imperfect family, is forever." "Forever and ever?" Sophie asked. "Forever and ever," James and Sarah said together, and they meant it. 2 years later, on a Sunday morning in early spring, Sarah stood in the kitchen of their brownstone making chocolate chip cookies from Emma's recipe, while Sophie, now 8 years old, helped measure ingredients and chattered about her upcoming dance recital. "And then we do a pirouette, which is super hard. But I've been practicing," Sophie was saying, demonstrating with a spin that sent flour flying. "Oops. Sorry, Sarah." "It's okay," Sarah laughed, wiping flour off the counter. "Cookies always involve a little mess." The front door opened and James's voice called out, "We're home!" "In the kitchen," Sarah called back, and moments later James appeared carrying an infant car seat, looking equal parts exhausted and radiantly happy. "Someone decided sleeping was overrated," James said, setting the car seat gently on the table. Inside, 6-month-old Emma Rose Hart, named after Sophie's mother with Sarah's full blessing, was wide awake and cooing at the ceiling fan. "Emma, you're supposed to nap when we go for walks," Sophie scolded her baby sister affectionately. "That's the whole point." "She's got her own schedule," James said, unbuckling the baby and lifting her out. Emma Rose immediately grabbed his nose with her tiny fist, which made everyone laugh. "I'll take her," Sarah said, washing flour off her hands. "You look like you need coffee." "I need coffee injected directly into my veins," James agreed, handing over their daughter. But he was smiling as he said it, the kind of tired smile that came from being exactly where you wanted to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. Sarah cuddled Emma Rose against her shoulder, breathing in that perfect baby smell while the infant grabbed fistfuls of her hair. It still felt surreal sometimes. 2 years ago, she'd been a nanny, hiding her past and helping a grieving widower raise his daughter. Now she was a wife, a stepmother to Sophie, and a mother to Emma Rose. She'd co-authored a new book with James's blessing, a practical guide for blended families navigating grief and new beginnings that was already on the bestseller list. She'd started a small practice seeing clients 1 day a week, mostly parents and children working through loss. She'd built a life she'd never imagined wanting. "Can Emma Rose have a bite of cookie dough?" Sophie asked. "Just a tiny one?" "Emma Rose is 6 months old," Sarah said patiently. "She doesn't have teeth yet. And raw eggs aren't safe for babies." "Oh, yeah." Sophie nodded sagely. "When she gets teeth, then cookies?" "When she gets teeth, then we'll talk about cookies." "You said the same thing about puppies," Sophie pointed out. "You keep saying, we'll talk about it later, but later never comes." "Later comes when you're old enough to walk a puppy yourself," James said, emerging from the coffee maker with a steaming mug. "Which means at least 2 more years." "That's forever," Sophie groaned dramatically. But she was grinning because this was a familiar negotiation in their household and everyone knew the rules. The doorbell rang and Sophie raced to answer it. "Aunt Kelly? Uncle Mike!" she shouted, and Sarah's niece and nephew came in, now 19 and 17, home from college and high school for spring break. "There's my favorite 8-year-old, Kelly said, scooping Sophie into a hug. Then to Sarah. "And my favorite person who legally has to love me." "I would love you anyway," Sarah said warmly, "but I'm glad it's required now." They all gathered in the living room, this beautiful, chaotic, blended family that had been born from loss and grief and second chances. Sophie showed Kelly and Mike her latest drawings, while James held Emma Rose and Sarah brought in cookies hot from the oven. They talked about Kelly's college classes and Mike's upcoming graduation and Sophie's dance recital next week. "I can't believe it's been 2 years since the wedding," Kelly said at one point. "It feels like yesterday, and also like you've always been together." "It feels that way to me, too," Sarah admitted. She looked at James, who was making silly faces at Emma Rose while Sophie giggled at his antics. "Like this was always how it was supposed to be. Do you ever miss it?" Kelly asked quietly. "Columbia? The research? The conferences and publications?" Sarah thought about it seriously. She did miss parts of it. The intellectual challenge, the feeling of breaking new ground, the respect that came with being Dr. Mitchell. But then Sophie said, "Sarah, come see the card I made for Emma Rose." And Emma Rose grabbed James's finger with her tiny hand, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. Both times. First when she'd given up her career for Kelly and Mike, and again when she'd chosen to stay in this family, building a life with James and Sophie instead of returning to academia. "No," Sarah said simply, "I don't miss it. This is exactly where I want to be." That evening, after Kelly and Mike had left and Sophie was in bed and Emma Rose was finally, miraculously sleeping, Sarah and James sat on their bedroom balcony watching the city lights. James's arm was around her shoulders, and Sarah leaned into his warmth, content. "You know what tomorrow is?" James asked. "Monday? The 3-year anniversary of when you interviewed for the nanny position." Sarah laughed softly. "Was it really only 3 years ago? It feels like a lifetime." "It's been the best 3 years of my life," James said seriously. "You saved us, Sarah, Sophie and me. We were drowning and you threw us a lifeline. You saved me too," Sarah countered. "I was lost. Hiding from my own life. You and Sophie gave me purpose again. Family again. Everything again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then James said quietly, "I went to Emma's grave today, while you were making cookies. I wanted to tell her about Emma Rose, about our family, about how happy Sophie is." Sarah went very still. James didn't talk about his first wife often, but when he did, Sarah always listened. Emma would always be part of their family's story, part of Sophie's history, part of what made James the man he was. "What did you say?" Sarah asked gently. "I told her thank you," James said, "for giving me Sophie, for teaching me how to love without reservation, for showing me what family means." He paused, then continued, "And I told her about you. I think she would have liked you, Sarah. I think she would be grateful that Sophie has you, that I have you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I wish I could have known her." "In a way you do," James said. "She's in Sophie's laugh. In the way our daughter loves unconditionally, in that chocolate chip cookie recipe you make every Sunday. Emma's love is still here, Sarah. And it doesn't diminish what we have. It enriches it." "I love you," Sarah said, turning to kiss him. "I love our family. I love this life we've built. I love you too," James said. "My brilliant professor, my children's champion, my wife. Thank you for taking a chance on a broken widower and his grieving daughter 3 years ago." "Thank you for seeing past the nanny to the person underneath," Sarah countered. "For giving me a second chance at everything." Inside, Emma Rose started crying. That particular cry that meant she was hungry and wasn't going to be patient about it. They both laughed. "Duty calls," Sarah said. "Standing. Our beautiful, demanding duty," James agreed. Following her inside, and as Sarah picked up Emma Rose and settled into the rocking chair to feed her, while James checked on Sophie one more time, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. From loss to healing, from loneliness to love, from broken pieces to a beautiful whole family. She'd been Dr. Sarah Mitchell, acclaimed professor and researcher. Then she'd been just Sarah, aunt and guardian. Then Sarah the nanny, hiding from her past. And now she was Sarah Hart, wife, mother, stepmother, and still occasionally Dr. Mitchell when she wrote or saw clients. All of those identities, all of those versions of herself, had led her here. To this brownstone with flour on the counters and toys in the corners, and a nursery painted soft yellow. To a husband who looked at her like she'd hung the moon. To a stepdaughter who made her cards that said, "Best bonus mom ever," and meant every word. to a baby daughter who had her father's green eyes, and her mother's determination and all the love in the world waiting for her. Some people got one chance at happiness. Sarah had gotten two, and she was grateful for every single moment of both of them. Later that night, when both girls were asleep and Sarah and James were finally in bed, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Kelly. "Thanks for today. You're the best mom person. Love you." Sarah smiled and showed it to James, who kissed her forehead and said, "They're not wrong. Go to sleep," Sarah said. But she was smiling as she turned off the light. In the nursery down the hall, Emma Rose slept peacefully. In the room next door, Sophie dreamed of dance recitals and puppies and sisters who would eventually be old enough to play with. And in the master bedroom, James and Sarah Hart fell asleep with their hands intertwined, grateful for second chances and stubborn daughters and love that arrived exactly when you needed it most, even if you didn't know you were waiting for it. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. But inside this brownstone, this family that grief had brought together and love had made whole, everything was exactly as it should be, perfectly imperfect, beautifully complicated, and absolutely, completely forever. What did you think of James and Sarah's story? Rate it from 0 to 10 in the comments below. My favorite moment was when Sophie figured out they liked each other and appointed herself their relationship cheerleader. That 6-year-old wisdom really hit home. What was your favorite moment? Did you predict Sarah's secret? Let me know. And if this story of second chances and unexpected love touched your heart, subscribe to Deep Stories for more emotional tales that move you. New stories every week. Stories that remind us that sometimes the best things in life come when we're not looking for them. They come when we're ready to receive them.